That was a big one.
Hello and welcome back.
Hello. Yeah, on this gorgeous spring day.
I know, it is so lovely out.
And we're like so springy today. And I tried to theme the cups today for the spring.
Look at you.
Oh goodness. Well, I am Elizabeth. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the prevention educator.
Awesome. I'm Justina. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the education and outreach coordinator.
And this is Wally. Wally's our guest today. Hopefully he doesn't talk too much. He is a therapy dog in training, so he is just hanging out.
Absolutely.
Being a good boy. Purebred good boy.
Yeah. Might be in and out.
Yeah.
It's Wally's world. We're just in it.
Seriously, though. He does have his own mug, though. I don't know if y'all can see it. So
yeah,
he is here for the coffee. Well, the water.
For him, yeah.
For him, yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of which, what are you drinking today?
I think in my magical world, because I'm only drinking water, I'm going to tell myself that I'm drinking boba tea, or else I'm going to spend a lot of money on that. So this is boba tea. It feels like that scene from Hook. Did you ever watch Hook?
Yes.
Yes, where there's no food on the table and they all pretend to be eating. And yeah, this is boba tea.
I love that.
Yeah. What are you drinking?
Also, sadly, water today.
We haven't coordinated very well recently.
We haven't, but that's okay. Just, it is what it is.
Yeah.
In my imaginary world, I'm thinking of like a peach tea almost.
Ooh,
to go with the lovely
peach.
weather.
Yeah.
So
very springy, summery.
Yeah, a very fruity person when it comes to my taste palettes.
Yeah.
So I love it.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess something we're trying to get better about saying is that there's always kind of a trigger warning with these topics, especially because this is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Obviously, some of the things we're going to talk about might be a little uncomfortable, but really just take care of yourselves, take care of each other.
Yeah.
Check in.
And we all can do better is checking in with not only ourselves but our loved ones.
Exactly.
And taking care of us, especially during this really emotionally draining month where we're committed to bringing awareness to this unfortunate reality and topic of sexual violence here in our community. So.
Yes, and incredibly frequent, unfortunately, in our society and at large, you know, so.
Very much so. I know last episode we talked a little bit about the statistics and how they're growing and the new CDC, I guess, numbers that they're reporting, which we still know is vastly underreported, but it is very much so a growing issue still.
Yeah. So what are we doing to change that?
That's a great question.
That's our job, isn't it?
Yeah. As prevention and education, the goal here is to provide education around these really uncomfortable topics.
Point. Yep.
To bring awareness to them. Absolutely. And to shift some of that perspective, but also trying to prevent it from happening again or even in the first place.
Yes. Yep.
I should say. So we talked a bit about some of our programming throughout the month at the end of our last episode. And so definitely throughout this whole month, we were very active both in the community and on Bowling Green State University's campus. There are definitely a lot of ways to help combat sexual violence in our community.
Yeah. Well, and I think one big way that we do it every year, especially in April, is Denim Day.
Yes, Denim Day.
Woo-hoo. It's just a day where you wear jeans, right?
No.
It's more than that? What? Explain.
Yeah. So Denim Day is the longest running sexual violence education and awareness campaign in the United States. And we are definitely very honored to continue that legacy and continue to promote the campaign efforts. A little bit of history around Denim Day. I know.
It's important.
It is so important. And is the reason why specifically we wear denim.
Yes.
So kind of bouncing back, in the early 1990s, there was a young 18-year-old woman in Italy, and she had signed up for driving classes with an instructor. Her instructor was an older gentleman, mid-40s, I think, and took her out for her first driving lesson, something that here in the United States is
Happens all the
normal.
time. Yep.
15 and a half, 16, 17-year-olds
Absolutely.
are with driving instructors
With a
often.
stranger, yeah, all the time.
Well, unfortunately, what ended up happening is that this driving instructor, chose to take this individual to a relatively secluded road and area,
Mm.
and forced her out of the car, wrestled her to the ground, and violently raped her. Um, and through her, well, and I also want to add, he then made her drive home
Oh gosh.
after that and threatened her, saying, if you tell anyone that this happened, I will hurt you. I will hurt your loved ones, which obviously is terrifying,
Yes.
especially after being assaulted.
Right.
Um,
As if
through
that wasn't traumatizing enough.
Absolutely. Well, and through her incredible strength, she decided to come forward and press charges against her perpetrator. And it went through the local courts in that area, and he was found guilty.
Well, that's good.
Good for the time being, at
Yeah,
least.
well.
Unfortunately, a number of years later, this individual came forward and challenged the verdict of this case and filed for an appeal. And it made its way all the way up through the Italian Supreme Court justice at that time. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is the Supreme Court said, well, this woman's jeans were so tight that she would have had to have helped take them off, and therefore implied consent in the sexual interaction that happened in the street.
I'm not
This,
going to rage because we're on camera right now, but
I know, and this led instantly to outcry. The women of parliament and other governmental figures the next morning showed up wearing denim, full denim outfits, which is uncommon, especially in parliament and
yeah.
government roles.
Yep.
And just has led to this movement. Shortly after, there is a organization in Los Angeles called Peace Over Violence that heard about the movement and the incident that was occurring in Italy. They had been doing grassroots efforts for sexual violence advocacy starting in the early 1970s.
Oh wow.
So when this came forward, they decided to run with it and created Denim Day.
Well, yeah.
As a campaign, as a campaign to then bring forth education and kind of protest the victim blaming rhetoric and the societal standards that we have for women, and to discuss consent and what that is or isn't.
Yeah.
With this campaign, so it's, like I said, the longest running campaign, and every year we wear denim to show our support and solidarity of survivors, as well as to start conversations around what is Denim Day, why do we acknowledge it, and why is consent so important, especially in modern day society 20 plus years later.
Right. That's so insane because like I knew that it was about her wearing jeans and her like them being tight, but I always assumed, coming from like an American perspective, that it like she there's a lot of victim blaming rhetoric and things like that of like, well, she was asking for it because her jeans were so tight. I didn't even realize that it went even further and said, well, if her jeans were that tight, she had to have helped take them off. Like that's insane.
And unfortunately, in the victim's impact statement that she made, she gives detailed accounts about how he ripped one of the legs, like the pant legs off of her, and she still had one pant leg in at the time of the assault, which, I mean, with that much detail,
completely against what they're saying.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's insane.
And unfortunately, that mindset is really damaging to survivors, to the systems in which they are seeking help with.
Unfortunately, still very common.
Unfortunately.
Right? Because that's the thing, is that, like, you said, when did this start?
This happened in the early 1990s.
Right. So, like, more than 20 years later, that is still something we hear all the time, you know? Like, the idea that someone was asking for it or someone helped, or, like, the idea of coercion or manipulation is not well understood.
Absolutely.
And we only think of sexual assault as force, but we very rarely talk about coercion and manipulation and how those can play into it as well, of like convincing someone that they have to say yes, threatening them so there's no other answer, right? And I think that all ties into this idea of consent and whether it's given or not given, and what that even looks like, because that's just insane to me, to have all that information and to still say she helped and she wanted or deserved it,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That's just wild.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, specifically with sexual violence perpetrated against women,
Mm-hmm.
that question of, well, what were you wearing is all too common.
So
And I
often.
understand that at some degree, there has to be a level of, I'm gathering data for your case, I'm gathering
Mm-hmm.
information about the situation, the incident that occurred,
Yeah.
whether that be for a police report, for a court, prosecution, or whatever that may be. But when we use that as the only question that we're framing, it therefore puts that blame on the survivor for their choices in attire,
Right.
or
Right.
for them inherently being at fault
Right.
for violence happening to them, when in fact it was the perpetrator's choice
Yeah. Yeah.
to choose violence.
Well, and my thing is too, it's all about context and tone and
Mm-hmm.
right? Like if the first thing you ask me after telling you that I was sexually assaulted is you ask me what I was wearing,
Mm.
that isn't that's not caring about me and my
No.
well-being at all, right? Like and we see that happen still very often,
Mm-hmm.
and something I feel like we talk about a lot off camera is that even as someone who's extremely informed who has these discussions all the time, it's still something I think I like, something that like kind of that like implicit bias
Mm-hmm.
idea, right, where like it's an automatic thought where I go, well, what was she doing, what was she wearing, like,
Yeah.
it's so ingrained in our society
Mm-hmm.
that even those of us who are most informed still have that thought. And guess what? We don't act on it. We don't ask
Mm-hmm.
that question because we know how harmful it can
Yeah.
be, right? And so like it all really comes down to just because you're thinking it doesn't mean you should talk, or it doesn't mean you should ask it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like especially when it comes to the well-being of the survivor.
Yeah.
um
I think that that's something that, you know, even is unintentionally done. Someone who is really trying to be supportive and gather information to support a loved one who
mhm.
comes forward with, disclosing their assault, we got to be intentional still with what our not only verbal communication but nonverbal communication says
Mhm.
to that person,
Yep.
as they're being very vulnerable about a really, really tough, um, situation.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh goodness. Well, I mean, I'm glad that you were able to share some info about
Yeah.
Denim Day, and I guess to go along with that, we can talk a little bit about what consent should look like,
Yes.
right? Because obviously, in that instance, consent was not well understood, and like I said, coercion and manipulation was the key piece in all of
Mm-hmm.
that for that poor young woman. Um, so I guess let's talk about what consent actually is. So
Yes.
I know we like to use the acronym fries because that's easy to
Yes. Like
remember,
French fries.
right? French fries, yes. So we talk about F being freely given, right?
Yes.
So that means in this case, this young woman, it was not freely given, right? She might have said yes. She was threatened. She was intimidated. That is
Mm-hmm.
not freely given,
No.
right? That is forced. That is coerced, right?
Mm-hmm.
So right off the bat, she does not check that box.
Right.
So not consent, right? If we do check that box, if someone does say yes please and it is freely given, it's also reversible,
Yes.
right? So someone can say yes today and say no tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
and that's okay, and that's their right.
Or even after they get started,
Yeah.
and they realize maybe this isn't what I want, maybe this
Mm-hmm.
isn't the right circumstances, I'm just not in the mood, is even a fair enough, reason, right?
Absolutely,
But like
right?
you can agree and
Yep.
start, and then halfway through, 10 minutes in,
Yep.
30 seconds in,
Right.
say, nope, I don't want this anymore.
Right.
And if that's not respected or reciprocated,
Then it's not consent.
then it's not consent and it's
Yep.
assault.
Yep. And then the I in fries is informed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if someone asks if it's ambiguous, right?
Mm-hmm.
If the question is ambiguous, that's not informed because we don't know what we're saying yes to,
Yeah.
right?
Specifically, like, what are we going to engage in?
Right, right. And even more than that, but like if someone asks if they can kiss somebody and then they do more than that, then the consent does not transfer,
Mm-hmm.
right? Someone consented to kissing, they did not consent to more than that. So
Right.
that's kind of that informed
Mm-hmm.
piece, is knowing what the other person wants,
Yep.
right? That E is enthusiastic, right? So that I always think of that going along with freely given, right? Because if someone is hemming and hawing and is kind of unsure or embarrassed or anything like that, it's not freely given, it's not enthusiastic.
Mm-hmm.
It should be a confident, overwhelming yes.
Right.
Right.
When we hear phrases like, I guess, or, yeah, I get,
You know,
sure,
right. That's
whatever,
fine.
like
Yeah.
whatever, then that's not really
That's not,
enthusiastic. And
no.
oftentimes, you know, especially in situations like that,
Hmm.
are where individuals are feeling guilty for
Hmm.
not engaging with their partner or
Yep.
someone, in that space.
Hmm.
Which also is not enthusiastic or freely given if you're
No.
feeling coerced or guilty for
Well,
not engaging.
and I think on a more basic level, because I think when we talk about coercion and manipulation, that feels very out of reach,
Mm-hmm.
right? But pressure, right, is something that I think a lot of people feel, especially with their partners or
Yeah.
their significant other, right? Where if there's any sort of pressure that someone feels to say yes, that is still not enthusiastic, that is still not
Mm-hmm.
freely given,
Yeah.
right? Um, and then the last one in fries is specific. So informed is the other person saying, this is what I want.
Okay.
Specific is, this is what I'm willing to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
So being specific about the consent that you're giving. So if someone says X, Y, and Z, this is what I want, and you say, I'm willing to do X, I don't want to do Y and Z.
Right.
That's being specific, right? So part of consent also is that two-way street where the other person has to give you all the information and you have to specifically say what you're willing to do back,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's a really important piece too, because if you are being specific but the other person isn't informing you, it's still not consent, right? um yeah, so that's just kind of like the basics.
Yeah. And I think too that other models of fries that are also pretty popular and
Mhm,
I think is also still very relevant,
mhm.
is the S being sober. That
Oh
consent
yes,
has to be sober.
yes,
Being under the influence, whether that's alcohol, cannabis, any type of substance,
yes.
if that person is intoxicated, they
It's not
can't give
consent.
consent.
It's not consent.
It's
Yep.
not.
Right. And I think you said this, but like if either party
Hmm.
isn't sober, right? It's not just the receiving part, it's both parties. If
Yeah.
either one is not sober,
Hmm.
it's not consent, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, I guess it's fries.
Fries.
But yeah, I definitely think I think that the difference was I'm used to working with high school kids, and high school kids don't do, they're always
What?
sober, right? But yes, I would say that for any human that is
Hmm.
engaging in something that requires consent, it
Hmm.
still needs to be sober, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess that does kind of lead us to the next thing, is that consent isn't just for the bedroom.
Mm-mm.
Consent is for a lot of things, right? Something that we talk a lot about with a lot of our younger folks is consent online, right?
Digital consent, yes.
Which is really difficult to navigate. And maybe someday we'll do a whole episode just on that, because it is
That's a hefty topic.
complicated. Complicated. We'll have to have Wally back to help us with that one. It is hard. So, but digital consent is a thing, right? Making sure that what's going on online is what
Hmm.
you agreed to. And again, those fries, it still matters no matter what
Hmm.
context we're talking about, you
Yeah.
know. I think one of the things I love about working here at the Cocoon is that we all of us employees, all of the advocates are very aware of consent. So
Hmm.
when it comes to using someone else's office, right? Using someone else's computer, sitting in someone else's chair, it's silly, but it means that I care about what you have to say,
Hmm.
right?
And respecting you and your boundaries
Exactly.
and those, really
That's
important
that's a
factors.
sign of a healthy relationship. Right? So, and I think a big piece of consent that we don't like to think about is being okay with someone saying no,
Yeah.
right? That is probably the hardest part. And I would say one of the biggest factors in boundary crossing is when someone says, no, I'm not okay with that. And the other person goes, well, I don't care. And they do it
Hmm.
anyway, right? And
Yeah.
that could be true for me sitting in your chair or someone being sexually assaulted.
Right. It's obviously a spectrum.
It's obviously a spectrum. They are
Right.
not the same, but I'm saying that boundary crossing is still the issue when
Hmm.
someone says no,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. And I think that, uncomfortable conversations around that everyday consent, like, yes, it might seem silly, especially for, people who are really well informed, or even just, students or are
Mm-hmm.
kind of learning to navigate through social situations, like asking things, can I give you a hug? Can
Right.
I hold your hand?
Mm-hmm.
I think that unfortunately a lot of our media has just kind of shown that there's like almost this desire for those things to just happen and to
Mm-hmm.
click. And not that there's necessarily anything wrong with certain things like holding hands or something where, that's not necessarily a huge boundary, but, fundamentally,
Right.
if we're practicing everyday consent with the small things,
Mm-hmm.
we can make shifts in our expectations
Mm-hmm.
for the big things. We
Right.
know that consent is, something that is really important and something that should be practiced every day. But it is a necessary element to those sexual interactions.
Mm-hmm.
And when we start applying these tools and these strategies and communication skills in our everyday life, we're making that shift
Mm-hmm.
towards a culture that respects boundaries, respects what individuals have to say, and promotes, that consent culture.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I would even say, like, to go along with that, for those folks where the end goal is a sexual interaction, everyday consent is what builds the trust
Mm-hmm.
to get the consent for a sexual interaction, right?
Right.
It's not guaranteed. But respecting someone's boundaries, being honest about what you want, trusting what they need, right?
Mm-hmm.
That all builds up to the end goal and whatever that might be for you in that relationship,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's also just like a fun way to practice
Yeah.
consent. And I've seen folks that do it on a regular basis and they almost just laugh about it because it should be fun and communicative and not in a demeaning way, but just kind of like, can I hold your hand, right? Like it can be fun and flirty if somebody
Mm-hmm.
wants it to be, right?
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, and so I definitely think that making this a part of your daily conversation, not just with your intimate partners,
Yeah, like
right?
this applies to platonic relationships,
Anybody.
to acquaintances,
Yep.
to literally any.
Random strangers. I
Mm-hmm.
can't stand when people touch me out in public that
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, right? Like making it very clear what your intentions are and saying, "Oh, excuse me, like I'm going to just step behind you," right? Just like it's just about voicing what's going on,
Yeah.
right? And that's all it is. But because it's so simple, I think so many people think that it's optional,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's just not. I was just teaching a group of folks the other day, and one of them in there was a young man, and he was like, I think it's ridiculous that you even have to teach this. And I was like, I don't disagree. This is extremely simple and it's something we all could be practicing. And he's like, but not many people do. And I was
Mm-hmm.
like, and that's why I teach it.
Nailed it.
Right. And so I definitely think that the conversation is starting to shift, but we really have to put an emphasis on how important consent is, even outside of the intimate relationship.
Absolutely.
Right. And I think we've really kind of hit the nail on the head with the victim blaming and the gaslighting, but
Yeah.
I just want to bring it up one more time.
Mm-hmm.
I think gaslighting is something that's very normalized. We know that victim blaming is, but
Yeah.
in terms of gaslighting, for those of you that don't know, gaslighting is essentially convincing someone else that their thinking is wrong,
Yeah.
or that they misinterpreted a situation, or
it's like intentional distortion of someone else's reality to
Yes.
fit your motive or
Yes.
your outcome or whatever that
Exactly.
is.
So like I would be gaslighting you if I told you that your shirt was purple, right? And we all know that
Mhm.
it's not, but if
Yeah.
I convince you that your shirt is purple, that's
Yeah.
gaslighting,
Yeah.
right?
No, that's another topic we could do a whole
a
episode on,
whole
with the
episode on.
history and everything about that.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
it's such, I think, a common thing in our society right now. I think there's been a lot of conversations and awareness around gaslighting, which I think is helpful,
Yes.
right? But also, there are unfortunately some trends where that's the goal, is to gaslight
And
for
the norm.
fun, and
Yes.
the norm.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think just even challenging those conversations, we talked in our last podcast episode about having conversations that are uncomfortable, challenging when you hear those, jokes and media consumptions and things like that promote violence.
Yeah.
Is something that is definitely important. The same thing here.
Right.
If you're seeing this, call it out.
Yeah.
Yep. and try to shift that not being so normalized.
Yeah.
In our interactions, especially with young people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because I think that's really where so much of that toxic energy is kind of brewing right now and kind of bubbling up into, is and I really see it coming from a lot of the social media stuff as well, because it's kind of at arm's length, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't feel as dangerous. It doesn't feel as impactful. And we know that it is, right? So I definitely think apparently we're going to do something, another episode about digital consent, because obviously we've brought it up several times, but
which makes sense in the modern world with what we're seeing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so if someone is struggling this month, since
Yeah.
it is April and it is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, how can they get a hold of us? What can we do for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you or a loved one need help, the Cocoon, especially for those who are in Wood County or are students at BGSU
Mm-hmm.
or Owens, or even if you work in this area, you are eligible for our services, which are
Mm-hmm.
free and confidential. And probably the fastest, most efficient way to connect with us if you're needing that support, whether it's emotional support, you're asking questions about processes or resources,
Mm-hmm.
is to call that hotline.
Yeah.
It is operating 24/7. So whether it's just because we recently had Easter, whether it's 4 a.m. on Easter
Yes.
or it's 6 o'clock on a Tuesday night, there is going to be an advocate there on the other end of the line to support you
Yep.
with what you need. And so to contact that number, it is the 419-373-1730, option
Option
2,
2.
and that will get you directly connected to that advocate,
Yes.
even if it's just a one-time call.
Mm-hmm.
Or
Yeah, there's no commitment to it.
absolutely.
Nope.
So you can call once and never call again,
Yep.
or we can definitely get you connected to some more consistent services with an advocate, to help navigate through whatever systems or needs that you may have. But
Yeah.
we definitely know that April is very difficult,
Yes.
especially with the rising frequency that we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing for sexual violence, and just continue to promote taking care of you in these moments, and what you need for your healing journey, and to have uncomfortable conversations like this.
Yeah. Well, and something else I'll add too, really quick, is that with April coming, we're in April, but we're moving through it quickly, I would say. For a lot of folks that are in college or in high school, the year's coming to an end, right?
Yeah.
And for some folks, the stress of that year coming to the end can bring up a lot of stuff. And then if you add on top of that any sort of media you're seeing about Sexual Assault Awareness Month,
Yeah.
if you have any lived experience, this is a tough time of the year.
It's like the
In
perfect
general,
storm.
it's a terrible storm.
And unfortunately, those trauma responses and
Mhm.
those trauma triggers that we see as a result of some of these victimization incidents are elevated or enhanced
Oh,
when
yeah.
we're stressed.
Yep.
So especially for those students, I know that Denim Day is the week of finals, at least for BGSU students.
Yep.
And it's definitely a lot. So continue to prioritize your health and
Yes.
well-being, and what that looks like, even if that means you need to disconnect for a little bit,
Mhm.
take a step back, take care of you. So
Yeah.
I can never promote that enough.
Wally agrees.
Big stretch.
Yep. Well, I think on that note, I think that's good for us, right?
For today, yeah.
Yeah. Wally got a good nap in. We got a good combo.
We did. So we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another new episode release.
Yeah.
And until then,
cheers. Yeah.
I had just enough water.
That's so funny.